So let's say, for example, you want to make something like, I don't know, 3,000 ducats a month in trade. Well, you've come to the right place. A lot of trade guides these days are really simple. They're like, here's a trade node, trade moves between places, thanks for watching, without really giving you any actual advice or substance. So while I don't do scripted guides anymore, I'm going to spew out about 5,000 hours of EU4 experience to hopefully make trade more understandable. This is a little bit more advanced than just a beginner's guide. I'm not going into just like how things work. I'm going into things that you actually care about, like what to do to make the most money possible. So if you're interested in something like that, then you should probably stick around. Also, you can check there are going to be like sections in this video, so if there's something in particular that you don't really know that much about, then you can just skip to that. That's perfectly fine. But in any case, let's begin. So, trade nodes, somewhat kind of arbitrary, also really important. They are everything in trade for EU4. Trade doesn't exist anywhere outside of the nodes, it's all handled entirely by the node system. Every node has a local value, which is just like the monthly sum of all of the trade value in each province that it contains. It adds all of that up together, nice and simple. Then depending on whoever holds power, it can either be collected or transferred. That's pretty much the simple part of it. End nodes, as we call them, like the English Channel, Genoa, and Venice, can't be transferred from. They are the end of everything. Trade either gets collected before it reaches here, or it will get collected at one of these three nodes. We have the opposite nodes, which are like Patagonia. They are starting nodes, which means they receive nothing from anywhere. They create a little bit of value and it almost immediately gets stolen. So nodes like Patagonia, the Amazonas, Hudson's Bay, and the Rio Grande are all absolutely terrible, in contrast to the three best nodes, Venice, Genoa, and the English Channel. You might have noticed these arrows. It means that trade can only flow in these directions. It cannot flow back up, and there are no closed loops in the entire game because of the way that the system works. If there were a closed loop, it would break everything. The general flow of trade is just like everything eventually reaches Europe. It is called Europa Universalis for a reason. But generally, to consider whether a node is good or bad, you can check the number of flows in it has and the number of flows out. For example, Alexandria in Egypt creates a decent amount of trade by itself, but because Constantinople, Venice, and Genoa all steer from Alexandria, it rarely keeps everything it has. In contrast, Sevilla is a fantastic node because it has 4 inputs and only 1 output to a place that Spain is usually going to have anyway, so that's why this is such a good node. Bordeaux as well, 3 inputs, 1 output to a place that France is generally going to have control over anyway. Lubeck as well, only 1 output, 4 inputs. This is like a pretty consistent theme, generally speaking. There are a few exceptions. There is a province that you'll automatically collect in. This is your main trading port. You can decide to move it away from your capital. For example, in this game, my country's capital is actually in South America, but I decided to move my trade capital back to the English Channel to make this much money. That is, of course, this button right here. Now that you know what a node is in the direction of trade flow, you'll want to figure out how do I get as much of that as possible. Well, to put it simply, take provinces like this. London has a center of trade and it's also an estuary. This province, also a center of trade. These are all centers of trade, they're the most important provinces. For a comparison, this province has a base trade power of about 13.4 before modifiers, and a province like this that doesn't have one is about 3.4. The more trade power you have, the more competitive you are in a node. Of course, most of that is going to come from your provinces, but it can come from other things. You can further modify these provinces by adding stuff like stock exchanges, which are a form of trade depot. That's this building up here. Of course, they're going to be most effective in a place that has something like a center of trade. You can also, of course, upgrade these. If you have 10 development like this, then you can go ahead and upgrade that to a level 2. If you have 25, you can upgrade it to a level 3. And it's mostly how you're going to get trade power after you take the provinces. Trade power is also affected by autonomy, so if you have high autonomy, the trade power is going to be decreased. Don't worry, it's only by half of the autonomy modifier, so for example, this province Dortmund here has a decent amount of trade power, but it's then further reduced by minus 45% because of that 90% autonomy. There is a way to get around that without turning things into states, as with trade companies, but we're not going to touch on that for a little bit longer. Another way of getting trade power is with this thing called caravan power. It applies only to trade nodes that have this little thing in the corner here that indicates that it is an inland trade node, meaning that it has no coastline. Putting a merchant in a node like this will give you a caravan bonus of plus 50 trade power, which can be pretty decent and sometimes pretty infuriating when the AI decides to do this. It's not going to be like a huge contributing factor to your trade power though. at least usually. Another thing you can do is send your ships to protect trade. I don't do this that often, maybe less than I should, but using light ships and only light ships, you can protect trade in a node, which will just add a little bit of additional trade power. For example, I have 13 ships here that are helping this trade node get an additional 44 trade power. If you compare that to the total 1,207 I have, it's really not that much. Although if I added more ships, then like it might be worth it, considering a lot of my money's being stolen here. Don't worry about that. If you own, I believe, Golden Century, maybe a few other DLCs do this as well, but you can create a flagship with something called trade route maps. It allows you to get +1 trade power per ship in fleet. By late game, this doesn't mean very much since, well, each of these ships actually has 3.5, and if I upgraded them, they would have 4 actually. Better in early game for sure. If you find that you can't protect trade for some reason, it's probably because you don't have the trade range, in which case the trade node will probably have like this kind of hatched pattern on it. In this case, we're too late into the game, I can reach everything, but it'll be pretty obvious over the node. Or it's possible that you don't have the supply range. This means you just need to like own a coastal province in that trade node and you'll be good to go. As an addendum, there is also another way of getting trade power, and that is simply by having trade power in a node further down. This doesn't sound like it makes a lot of sense, but don't worry, I can explain. So for example, you see this Wien node here? You see how it's owned 100% by Austria? Like literally all of it, completely 100% owned by Austria. They have 3 level 3 centers of trade, they have 2 level 2 centers of trade, they own every province in here, and yet I have 14% power. This is because of transferring from traders downstream. In this case, I only have 29, but my subject Köln has a lot more than that, and I'm stealing their trade, so that's why I have so much. This is super useful in places where, like, let's say you have no land, like you're, I don't know, Portugal, and you want to steal all of my Ivory Coast trade, you know, just as an example. Portugal, of course, has nothing in the Ivory Coast. Literally nothing. But they have a lot of the trade power, a lot being 14. It's not a lot, but you can see that they're getting 88 trade power from this, and that's because that is exactly 20% of their province trade power in Sevilla. So that's also important to keep in mind if you want to steal somebody else's trade. The simplest way to do that before actually taking their land is to simply increase the absolute amount of trade power you have in a node. As I mentioned earlier, the easiest way to get more trade power is to upgrade these centers of trade and to add buildings like stock exchanges. Because it's only provincial trade power, these are pretty much the only ways you're going to do this. There are also a couple of trade power modifiers I should explain. There's global trade power, which pretty much does as you would expect it to. You can see I get plus 15% from prestige here, and I have maximum prestige, which gives, you guessed it, 15%. Pretty simple. My other modifiers give me a total of 61%, but yeah. This applies to every single one of your trade nodes indiscriminately, so it's a pretty good modifier. The other two, which are slightly more complicated, is domestic trade power versus trade power abroad. The game never explains this, which is why I'm going to tell you. A trade node is considered a domestic trade node if you own 50% or more of the provincial trade power. This means specifically the total tally under this part right here. If this total number makes up more than 50% of what every province would sum up towards, then it becomes a domestic trade node. For example, Persia. I do not have 50% of the trade power in Persia, but I do have over 50% of the provincial trade power, which means that it is a domestic node. In contrast, Bengal, I do not have over 50% of the provincial trade power, which means this node is considered abroad. This is important because you'll see your abroad trade nodes fluctuate quite a lot with overextension. You take a lot of overextension, you'll get a direct reduction in trade power abroad, which means it should be your goal to have at least 50% of the provincial trade power in as many nodes as possible, so you don't end up tanking your trade every time you take land. Alright. Next comes the fun part, merchants as well as transferring stuff. This is the part that people have the trouble with the most, which is completely fair. But if you know what you're doing, there's a lot less trial and error. So number one, how do you get merchants? You can see I have 19, and guess what? I do not have trade ideas. I usually find that they're completely unnecessary. I'm getting these merchants from creating trade companies. If I put over 51% of the provincial trade power in the trade company, then you get a merchant. Remember, this is the same qualification to turn a node into a domestic node compared to a node which is considered abroad. For example, if I were to put these provinces into trade companies, first of all, it would be pretty much impossible to convert, but also you get 1, a lot more local trade power, and 2, that provincial trade power now gets contributed towards the amount which is considered part of the trade company. Okay, so take for example, I just created this trade company in Bengal, right? You can see I definitely have over 50% of the province trade power. This means it is no longer suffering from the minus 50%. The overextension isn't affecting it anymore. But it also isn't giving me a merchant because even though I have more than 50% provincial trade power, it doesn't mean that over 50% is actually in the trade company. Instead, just for the sake of a little bit of demonstration, I can go ahead and add a few more provinces, which is going to add a tiny little bit of trade power, and now we should have 51.4% in the trade company, which is going to give me that 20th merchant. This is pretty much rinse and repeat for every single trade company, but I'm going to get a lot more in-depth with trade companies a little bit later. There is another reliable method, and that is having a colony which has 10 provinces. For example, my colony Vinland only has 7 provinces, not 10, so we're not going to get an extra merchant. You also get one from global trade. I think you can get one from forming an East India company or something. There are a bunch of different ways of getting more merchants, but you don't have to take trade ideas. Anyway, the best part, transferring trade. So the way trade is kind of competed on by countries is basically you have the people who are trying to transfer trade, and you have the people who are trying to collect trade, all within the same node. Everyone who's trying to transfer is basically fighting everyone who wants to keep it. Even if you aren't directly transferring trade, it doesn't mean that trade cannot be transferred. So, for example, I own 91% of Novgorod, there's no merchant in here, yet, because of the generous countries that are trying to steer trade for whatever reason, it's all being moved anyway. If I were to put a merchant in here and tell it to transfer trade, it would start using my 91% trade power to shift trade in whatever direction I wanted to go. Likewise, if I decided to collect trade in here, it would use my trade power to collect from this node instead of letting it be transferred. In this case, it might be roughly 85% of the trade power. If I decide to do that though, I would get a penalty, which is what we can see down here. Since I am collecting in the Constantinople node, you can see I'm losing 63.6% of the trade power I have in this node. Is it worth it? Yes. In this case it is, but not always. The only reason I would collect in this node is because the trade that's in here has no other direction to go where I can collect it. Constantinople doesn't end up ever flowing into the English Channel, not without getting through a couple of places that I have absolutely no control over. If I decided to remove this merchant, you would see that my capital would receive a massive amount of trade power increase. This is because for every merchant you have transferring trade, you gain 10% trade power in the capital. This is good, yeah, but only for as long as you don't have that much control in your capital. Now, by default, if absolutely no one is transferring trade, you can see like down here in Lima, where nobody's doing anything here, it'll just split evenly. So in the best case scenario, you actually do want to have somebody transferring the trade, and that's for another really important reason called trade steering. My favorite modifier that nobody understands. Honestly, it's super simple and it's the entire reason why I have a merchant in this node. I have 100%, why bother, right? Well, it's because having a merchant here increases the outgoing value of all the trade in here by 8.6%. Without this merchant in here, I would only be pushing 447 ducats instead of 485. It doesn't stop just there though, because this 8.6% seems like it's kind of arbitrary, but it's not. By default, the first merchant adds a 5% bonus, which means yes, if you have one merchant transferring trade out of a node, that's a default 5%. It also applies on top of that your trade steering modifier. We have 23%, but also in this one particular node, because it's a trade company, I added this here for another plus 50%. So that's 5 times 1.73, and that should give you roughly 8.6 like we see here. Should also mention the easiest way to get trade steering is through Navy tradition. Despite my best efforts, I can never really get that much Navy tradition because I don't take naval ideas, but you can get a decent amount by protecting trade. It's based off of how much of your force limit you have in ships protecting trade, and that'll give you a relatively decent amount of navy tradition. Of course, there are also like temporary modifiers, you know, missions, all that stuff. It doesn't stop there though, because if you have multiple countries steering trade from a node, it actually applies a whole lot of that. You get diminishing returns, and after 5 you don't get anything at all, but 5 countries steering trade is increasing this outgoing value from 678 to 792. Over 100 ducats just by having merchants steer trade. They don't even have to be your merchants, they don't have to be friendly merchants, they can be your worst enemy like the Ottomans. These guys hate me. As long as merchants are steering trade, it's going to increase that value. So for example, if you were to have, let's say, a super helpful colony in Canada, they might transfer trade from the Chesapeake Bay without you having to do anything. They're going to increase that value by 7.8%, sending it into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. They'll do the same thing with Ohio, increasing the value by 7.8%, and then you just shove your own merchant in there, increase it by 6.1%, and then send that straight to the North Sea. This means, in essence, you want to have as many merchants as possible transferring trade as much as possible. Well, what if you don't have that much trade power? That's still kind of okay. For example, if I were to put this new fresh merchant we just got into Coromandel, I would start using 5% of my trade power to start transferring down to the Cape of Good Hope. This would be a useful merchant. Even though it's not that much money, it prevents other people from stealing it and moving it towards them. So as a general rule of thumb, if you're looking for places to put merchants, you want to start off with trade nodes that are closest to your home node. Not necessarily geographically, just by degree of separation. This means that Champagne is as close to the English Channel as the Ivory Coast is, for example. Then you can start fooling around with things like additional degrees of separation, working mostly off of how much trade you could get and how much trade power you have in there. The ideal scenario is where you end up having something like a chain that goes across the world, because keep in mind, let's say you have trade that starts in Canton, and then you put a merchant in there, it increases the value, it gets added to here, the merchant pushes it along, increasing the value into here, merchant adds value, into here, merchant adds more value, here, here, and then, you know, the rest is history. By having this many merchants, the value compounds significantly, so that the original value of this might be 55 ducats locally, but in the end could end up something like 100. Stealing additional value from nodes almost always trumps just like putting one in a node you already control. Not always, but yeah, usually. For example, if I moved the guy from Kazan into Saxony, I might make more money, but this is one of those cases where you just have to like play around a little bit. The merchants I know that I'm making money off of are for sure Astrakhan, Samarkand, Persia, anywhere that I'm actually stealing money from people who would otherwise be taking it from me. The other thing with merchants is, this might be a DLC feature for Cradle of Civilization, I don't remember, but there are these things on the side. You don't have to worry about them too much, I very rarely touch these. They'll give you a couple of node-specific bonuses, but they're like kind of niche, and really only there if you feel like min-maxing a whole lot. Except this one's really good. One thing that I see all too often with new players that kind of hurts my soul a little bit is they'll just go down to here, they'll be like, how much money is in here? Oh, let's just send someone into here, let's send someone into there. And, you know, I was guilty of this when I started off playing as well, but hopefully with this information you should know how to send trade along a nice, neat path to reach your trade capital. Of course, you want to have as much trade power as possible in the capital, or else someone else is just going to take your money. Case in point, let's take a look at how much trade money people are making. Alençon here has the 8th highest trade income because they have 5% of the English Channel. I just never got around to getting rid of them. So, by having 4% of 2,000 ducats, they are making 129, which is more than, for example, Korea, who holds all this land over here. So, yeah, the amount that you collect can be pretty disproportionate to the amount that you're contributing. This is a huge advantage when you're starting off in some place like India. You just take the trade centers and then boom, you don't have to do anything, you just take their money. Speaking of money, let's talk about how that actually gets created. I mentioned earlier that the local value of a trade node is the sum of all of the trade value in each province. Now this is probably the simplest part of the video. You want to know how much a province contributes? Goods produced times the price of the good. That's it. That is the yearly value that that province will contribute in trade. And you want to know something special? That's actually the same number as production. So we can see here, this province is contributing 0.46 ducats a month to the local value of this node. The price of goods can increase or decrease. Sometimes it's temporary, sometimes it's permanent. As a rule of thumb, goods that are consistently really good are going to be metals or luxury goods. So like cloth gets pretty decent in the late game. Iron's pretty alright. Silk is good. Dyes, spices, gems, paper, cotton even. Those are a couple of very good and very general goods. And then you have the king of goods, coal, at the end of the game, which might be a Rule Britannia only feature. And then over here we have cloves, which are only found in this region. Now, counterintuitively, you can't control the price of goods. It just sort of happens through event. So the only thing you can really control is how much you produce. There are two components to this. There's the flat rate, which you can see at the very top there. It's 0.7. Each point of Diplo Dev gives you 0.2. And one of my trade company investments gives 0.3. I could also decide to add a farm estate, which will add a flat 1. As far as I'm aware, this is the highest you can get in a province before you just decide to start developing it more. So after you've maxed out the flat rate, then you want to increase the modifier. You can see we have plus 300%, which is why we're making so much money. Furnaces are a Rule Britannia feature which you can build on top of any coal province to give you a global 5% goods produced modifier. Trading in coal will also likewise give you a global 10%. There are missions, there are reforms, there are a lot of things that can give you goods produced modifiers, but the number one way to do it is trade companies. Now, trade companies could really be their own video. There's a lot to get into here, but I'm just going to give you the stuff that you care about, and that's pretty much just like a step-by-step instruction on what you should do with them. This is 135% goods produced to every province which is not in a trade company. That part is incredibly important. In fact, I wish they had never added this button ever, because you should never, ever, and I need to underline that again, ever click it. The amount of money you will lose by clicking this button is unfathomable. You might lose up to, and I'm not joking, like 50% of the money you're getting out of this. Not only that, but you're also going to waste a lot of governing capacity. Trade companies cost more governing capacity compared to territories, which is why you should not make that many. We can also see the clear as day difference between the goods produced in this province. It is 180% compared to a province which is not in the trade company, which is getting 316%. The bright side of a trade company is you are going to get roughly half of the production out of it, but you're also going to be losing like half of the trade value, so it kind of balances out. At least in the short term it kind of does, but keep in mind you can't put production onto like a trade line. The trade will compound through nodes, the production won't, so like just don't trade company everything. You should trade company centers of trade and estuaries. That's what's actually contributing to this increased goods produced. If you have extra governing capacity lying around and somehow you need more money, you could, if you wanted to, throw a province into the trade company, which normally wouldn't really give you much anyway. For example, this gold province isn't going to get affected by the trade company. It's like the only thing that doesn't, which is pretty tragic. So if we add it into here, we'll see that, you know, the amount of money we get isn't decreased, but it does allow us to put something in here, like a broker's exchange. And the broker's exchange does affect the gold province, gives you an additional 0.3 goods produced, and it also affects these provinces here. So basically, you're sacrificing one province to allow for investments in other provinces. I wouldn't recommend immediately investing in these. They do take quite a long time to pay off, and you want to make sure that you're spending your money on actually stealing more trade before you just compound yourself into a trade snowball. You should try to make sure you have a clear path for your trade to make it through before you try to use these investments. Otherwise, you're not going to see a good return in a long time, and you could be using that money on conquering, so... Once you're sitting on a fairly comfortable amount of money, I would say maybe, I don't know, 200 ducats a month, starting to slam down these trade company investments can be really good. On top of that, if you want more money, just applying trade steering is great. It's even more expensive, so make sure you're going to get your money's worth out of that. The other investments are pretty self-explanatory. I only ever usually take these two. Local defensiveness and supply is okay, I guess, but I generally just don't do that. So, to recap, trade company centers of trade. Make sure you do enough to get the merchant, put the merchant in there, shove it along the line. That's pretty much it. There is also one last thing to do with trade, and that's privateering. I was doing some privateering over here, but that was mainly because I was stealing treasure fleets from people, so, you know. Spain and Portugal used to have like really big colonial empires, and I was just stealing their treasure fleets. it can get you some pretty decent income. On that note, treasure fleets, I'm sure you're probably aware of them, but you do have to eventually be downstream of a treasure fleet. So for instance, if you're Spain and you take Peru, it's totally fine because this trade goes up into here, and then it goes up into here, and then it goes over into Sevilla. You don't even need to have merchants there, it just needs to be possible. Yeah, other than that, privateering, I don't find it usually worth too much. It's super situational. I can't even give good advice on it. If I just want to start trolling some countries, I'm gonna do it, and that's pretty much the only reason. But yeah, one thing I forgot to mention is mercantilism, mostly because I forget about mercantilism in the majority of my games. It's like, okay. Provincial trade power modifier is nothing to scoff at. It actually is pretty decent, but usually there are just a lot better things to spend your Diplo on. I certainly wouldn't make it a priority. In fact, I would probably spend it right now just because I have nothing else to spend Diplo on, and that's pretty much it. So yeah, that's pretty much it for the explanation of trade. I could go into a couple of scenarios for like different countries, what you should probably do. Take for example Portugal. As Portugal, you should conquer the entire Sevilla node, which means yes, killing Castile, preferably before they form Spain. At the same time, you should move into the Ivory Coast and colonize into the Caribbean. Once you've consolidated the Ivory Coast in the Caribbean, then you can go into, like, let's say, Brazil or something, or maybe like Mexico. Also colonize the Cape of Good Hope, and then you move backwards, you know, you conquer upstream, you try to get as much trade power in each node as possible before you move on to the next one. Otherwise, you're gonna end up with a mistake like I did, where I didn't take all of Astrakhan, so I'm losing like 200 ducats here. But don't worry about it, it mainly works out anyway. Now, let's say you're in like a really awful node, just like an absolute garbage, trash, no good node, like Wien, for instance. I think I've established this is some hot garbage. You receive trade from 2 places, sure, but you also send trade to 3 places. One of those being Venice, which has a lot of trade centers in there. So, simple solution, conquer Venice, move your trade capital there. It really is that easy. Or if you take, for example, this run, I started as Norway, clearly. Your trade capital is in Lübeck, but you're not getting that much out of it. You can conquer Denmark, but pushing into the HRE is going to take a while, so what you can do instead is push into England, take the English Channel, a little bit from France, and then eventually start gobbling up parts of the HRE just to consolidate your power. I got lucky and I got the Burgundian inheritance before I flipped over to Norse, so that wasn't too much of a problem for me. That is one of the few scenarios where you want to conquer downstream rather than upstream. If you can make your home node a better trade node, then absolutely go for it. It'll definitely help you in the long run, even if it might be a little bit painful in the short run. Other difficult nodes, let's say for example you're playing like Poland, Krakow is also one of those absolutely abysmally awful nodes. The main issue is how much trade the Baltic is going to steal from you, so just conquer the Baltic then. Again, pretty simple logic. Just go to the place which is the strongest and then make it your home node and then transfer your stuff from the previous node to your new home. It really is that simple. As for trade companies, keep in mind you have to have them outside of your subcontinent. So because my capital is actually here in South America, even though my trade capital is in the English Channel, which is in Western Europe, I could still, if I wanted to, create a trade company in Germany. So it's about the subcontinent of your capital. Also, this should be pretty obvious, but you can't make trade companies in the New Worlds. Hopefully I mentioned that. If I didn't, yeah, that's a pretty big part of it. So no Australia, no North or South America. So once you start expanding outside of your subcontinent, I would say go for it as long as the trade kind of lines up in that general direction. So for example, if I were playing Byzantium, I wouldn't trade company Tunis. At most, I would state them. At the very least, I would ignore it altogether. There's so much more you can get from, for instance, India or Persia, which are outside of your subcontinent of Eastern Europe. It's all about conquering backwards. Consolidate your home node, then move over to whatever transfers to your home node, and then you just keep on going. If you have too many merchants and not really enough places to put them, then you could always just put an additional one in your home node. This will give you an extra 10% trade income, which in this case is equal to about 190 ducats per month. So yeah, you know, it's worth something. You can get more trade efficiency from like a bunch of different things. Not really worth going over all of them, other than technology, keeping the burgers happy, and then just like slapping a merchant in here. But that's going to be it for today's guide in quotation marks on trade. More of a rant if I'm being honest. I get a lot of people coming into the streams over at twitch.tv/CorbyGaming asking me how trade works and particularly trade companies. So hopefully this gives you a good enough answer. And if there's anything I missed, go ahead and ask the question in the comments down below. I will answer it with a pinned comment to let everyone know. But for now, this is Corbett signing off, and as always, have a fantastic day. Big thanks to the patrons this month, especially Yeo, Baby Cal, Q-Brute, Quiet Guy, Torvald, Robert Caleno, Ambient Cyan, James Levy, Chewy Shoot, The Watcher, and Brova. For just $1, you can join the Patreon and get early access to videos.